Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to be looking at understanding text, context and medium. And we're going to be going through all the things you need to know about a text, its surrounding context, so everything that surrounds a text, all of the things that are influential in the construction and also the meaning of a text. Basic notes on medium as well, so a text's medium and what effect it has on meaning as well. First of all, text and context is basically the relationship between a text and the world around it. What that means is sort of looking at a text in relation to everything that goes into making it. Not only that, but also sort of cultural assumptions, social assumptions, and the way that different people from different periods of time, from different cultures and different ways of life look at a text through analyzing it and interpreting it. How a text fits into those things, how it fits in the culture, how its ideas relate to both the time of its writing, the historical context of when it was written. So even the text written yesterday will still have historical context as far as yesterday, and a contemporary reading, so one that we get now. What has changed between the time the text was written and now? What is important? What meaning do we get that changes? And particularly you'll notice that if you do Shakespeare, for instance, where there's about a 400-year gap between the time when it was written and modern society when we're interpreting it. And particularly a lot of things that we use Shakespeare to interpret, for instance, are things which Shakespeare wouldn't have even considered or contemplated in his time. So it's one of those things that having context is important for shaping future meaning and, of course, different meanings that come from a text, and even things which become relevant and things which change out of time where they're almost completely forgotten. Now, medium, on the other hand, also affects how a story is constructed through the fact that different mediums are presented in different ways. And we're going to look at that as well. And first of all, let's look at context and what it is. Studying context involves analyzing, just going into depth about looking at how a text fits into the world around it. No text can be fully understood when isolated from the world. Which means, yes, you can get a fair understanding, and of course it's actually quite good to read text in isolation first, not only with you reading it independently, but also not looking at it in terms of the world it was written around, so it doesn't really influence your opinion straight away. Read it, understand it, get your own understanding, and then go off and do research about the time it was written, who the author was, what sort of movement they were a part of, if they were a part of a movement, what their political views were, whether they had a family, what the time was like, were they rich, were they poor, were they famous? All those things are important to fully understanding what the meaning of a text is. When you are sort of putting your response together, if a question asks you a bit about its context and really understanding it, then that is quite important and does shape meaning and the reason why certain components of the text are the way that they are. Having a look at context does help to sort of add that final piece to the overall puzzle of how it's all put together. A text also can't be consistently and universally. And what I mean by that is that it does change over time. A text which is seen as good or socially accurate at a particular time may not be so in the future. So if you read a lot of stories, for instance, like Brave New World or George Orwell's 1984, then what you'll find, yes, there are differences between what is emphasized as happening in these particular time periods at that time and what actually does happen. That's something that's not consistent with the time of them being written. Of course, they're trying to predict the future, so that's always quite difficult. And universally, so my interpretation of a text living in Australia will be different from someone who's looking at a text coming from an American society or South American society or an Asian society or an African society or any society for that matter. Even societies within our own country will look at things differently depending on whether they're rich or poor, what their religious beliefs are, what their upbringing is, all those things. So things are interpreted on the basis of a person and their own beliefs. However, there can be some things which overlap, which sort of form part of the universal consensus, but of course it's not exact. That's what context is. Now let's look at the next bit, which is text and context in the Border Studies syllabus. This requires you to analyze what informs a reading, so how you read it, what meaning you get out of it, as well as the different ways interpretation can be made. Not only the things that shape your understanding, but how you then understand it yourself. What parts of the text shape your understanding, and then how do you interpret those things? Those are the two things that the Border Studies and the outcomes require you to do when you're looking at text and context. Let's go through it in a little bit more detail. To find the context of text involves research around the time period when the text was composed, and of course you would compare that to now. If you understand the culture of the period, it is easy to critique and analyze the work relative to the period of time when it was written. Looking at the pictures to my right here, you might notice that yes, both of these are cars. But of course they are cars from their respective time periods. If people in the late 1800s were thinking of a car, they were thinking about the image to the top there, which was a poorly working, barely feasible sort of object that didn't really go very far and broke down a lot. When we think of a car now, we think of something a little bit different. Now, we may not necessarily be thinking of a big, loud sports car, but we think of a car a lot differently now. We think of it as convenience, we think of it as luxury, we think of it as almost an icon. Our meaning of those particular references in two texts are different. While a text from perhaps somewhere in the 1800s might think of cars as being trouble ahead, now we think of cars as a luxury and as something that a society we become almost over-dependent on. The way that we look at cars now are very different from how they would have been looked at before. And this is one example of how the meaning of text changes throughout time period. Ethics and the sort of moral judgment of characters might be different depending on the societies that are judging them. Each work is relative to its time period. Now, of course, when you interpret it, you'll be interpreting it from the world you live in now. And a lot of questions will go on to how you interpret the text from your standpoint and how you're based on your world experience, and may ask you to talk about that. That's the sort of thing that you will talk about, is the way that you see things being different from, say, how someone else sees them. Through this, it is possible to identify, discuss, or evaluate how a text changes in the meaning over that time period. The meaning of car is something that has changed quite significantly as the technology has developed, but it's not necessarily a technological thing. It can be socially. For instance, if you're looking at something like attitudes towards women have changed a lot, and for the better in the last 100 years or so, from women simply being able to vote to women being able to have the same rights and the same sorts of legal protections as men do. Before 100 years ago, that wasn't quite the case, whereas now we do have that. It's something that society has changed in its morals and ethics. Meaning of a text, therefore, when talking about women in the early 1900s compared to now, has changed over that time period. Let's look at contemporary context and what meaning that has. When you look at a contemporary context, you're arguing the value of a text to modern society, and you're dictating how it is relevant. Of course, if you're looking at Shakespeare, the common groan I get from most students is, oh, it's not relevant because it was written 400 years ago. Yes and no. Yes, it was written 400 years ago, and yes, probably Shakespeare wasn't really considering that 400 years after his death, people would still be talking about his work. However, the thing about it is that there are still a lot of ideas, and the quality of language is still such, it still has value today. And the ideas and the fact that a lot of Shakespeare's work was developed from history, a lot of the ideas that have existed in his time were over 2,000 years old and still haven't really changed that much from that time where he lived to now. Discussing and evaluating a text to modern society involves taking in all those factors, understanding what it is that those texts do, basing your own interpretation and basing your own ideas on those sorts of arguments. By comparing and contrasting themes and ideas to social and current paradigms or trends that are happening now, you're deciphering how a text retains value and if that value does remain consistent. In my earlier example, when I mentioned the rights of women, that's something that has changed quite a lot. By deciphering how a text retains value, if a text has a narrow-minded view towards women's rights, then obviously that's something that has changed over time, and that the value of that text is probably lessened quite significantly. When half the students in the class read it and go, oh my God, this is horrible, then, and even boys in the class will be going, oh my God, this is horrible, then it doesn't really retain its value. You need to look for themes and ideas which sort of do have a little bit of universal quality or are persistent. So ones that can retain their value over time. Ones which are consistent, which can stay. Say, well, yes, themes and ideas in the story are not necessarily universal or consistent or persistent. The one thing about it is you're trying to find ones that are as much as possible, because they are ones which do have a lot more that you can talk about, but also the ones that are far more easily recognized in your responses. While it's not necessarily true that each text can be interpreted the same way by everyone, by finding ones which are persistent and which do carry on through time, you're able to compose your argument a lot easier and you don't have to explain it as much. So that's a simple thing. So if you come up with a completely obscure point, one that doesn't really make a lot of sense, or if you're trying to discuss a point which was valid 100 years ago but it's not really valid now, it's not something that you can really include in your response unless you're talking about that particular time period. You may also be asked to draw links between texts. Text and context involves comparing texts to each other as well. By comparing a work to its counterparts, works that are similar, works that have links to others, you're looking at things from, you could look at how a similar story is written at a different period, a different place, by a different person. For instance, if you're looking at how a horror movie or how a horror text has been composed now as opposed to maybe 50 years ago, there's a big trend difference. So if you're looking at sort of older horror movies, there's a lot more emphasis on suspense, drama, whereas modern horror movies are dependent more on violence, gore, and trying to shock the audience. There is quite a different way of looking at a text just purely on the time period. the place where they are composed, and the qualities of whether the writer comes from an affluent life, a developing country, or wherever it may be from, what kind of person is who is writing it, if they have very outspoken views, if they are quite conservative, if they are just trying to tell a story. All these things have qualities, and when you're comparing one author to another, you sort of have to look at those things as well. Now, when you're responding to questions relating to context, you're attempting to say how the meaning of a text is shaped by the combination of the text and its context. In other words, how you look at it, how you get that interpretation, how you get that meaning from the text and the world around it. By looking at those two things together, what you are doing is you're interpreting that relationship between you reading the text and the world around you. It's asking you to sort of open up your horizons and be quite open-minded a bit. It just requires you to look at things from a more universal perspective. Now, you might look at things like, for instance, how a text is relevant to modern society, which we sort of looked at already. How a text is shaped by the time it was composed, the sorts of things that were happening at the particular time when it was written. How ideas reflect the human experience. It might be how people survive war, how people survive poverty, how people survive oppression, all those things. Quite powerful storytelling methods and do relate a lot to their context. And a relationship between texts of different eras. The horror movie example, how you can compare a horror movie from the 1950s to probably one from now. So all those things are quite different, and when you're answering the question, those sorts of things do come across as being as significant when you're putting in the response together. You may also look at the relationships of text between different authors. How one author who might be outspoken is different from one who is from a different culture or from a different way of life. Those sorts of things can change as well. You may look at relationships of text between different mediums. Basically, a relationship between a film and a book. So let's have a look at that last one, because this one has a bit of an interesting connotation as well. If you have a look at relationship between medium, you could be looking at a couple of things. You could be looking at either one text and its relationship from its film version to its book version, or whatever it may be. Or you may be looking at two different texts, one which is a book and one in which is a film, but they are both different texts. They are different stories. Depending on the text you're studying, this may require a distinction between various forms. And it may require you to sort of go, well, how are these two texts, which are pretty much the same or similar, or have similar sorts of ideas, done differently in their different mediums? And that's one of the things that is quite an interesting thing to look at, particularly when you're looking at how meaning is constructed and how value is constructed. By looking at those two things side by side, you're starting to get a little bit more of an understanding of how different mediums sort of do shape meaning in their own ways. Most of your analysis will focus literally on that construction. The way a text is designed from one form and how is appropriate to the other. So if you look at a movie of a book, then you'll see that a lot of sacrifices often have to be made by a movie to make the book, because the book is something that can take about 8 hours if you were to film scene by scene, which you can't have in a cinema because everyone will be asleep by then. What you have to do instead is you have to cut really important bits out and try and then reshape the story a little bit. And that's why often a lot of people who watch films of a book go, well, the book was better. In some cases that's not true, but in a majority of cases, yes, there is that complaint. However, it's something that's very interesting to look at, and something that you will have to look at if you are studying two texts which have the same sorts of ideas, and work out how does those different mediums and how, when you're looking at them side by side, affect how you see it and how you look at things. So that's basically it for text and context and medium. Main points to really be thinking about is that different texts and related to the world around them, that when you are interpreting a book or a film or any other type of text, that you should be trying to look at it first within your own world and then look at it from the world around you. So do some research, do some following up. Go on Google. Google's such a convenient tool for that. Look at some things about it and try and get a whole heap of ideas that have come from different people. Look at how it's interpreted by different people, societies, cultures, in either their historical context or their modern context. When you're having a look at medium, remember that because of the fact two mediums convey their ideas in different ways, that you've got to then examine those relationships and really understand what you believe. And it is about what you believe, relevant, and then be able to justify them with your evidence in your discussion like you normally would. But otherwise, that's about it for text and context and medium. Until next time, I'll see you later.